shine and the sun meet the street. Though I may be dreaming, I know that I will always find plenty to ease my mind, drinking country wine.
Hi there. Sorry about the delay in answering this, but we got round to it eventually. In answer to question 1 about my childhood influences, I was brought up in Hove in Sussex. That's Hove in Sussex, on the south coast of UK. And during those times, I mean, just to set the scene, we're probably talking about 60s, really, the most formative time, my teenage years in the 60s. Obviously the music scene was changing a lot at that time, and I suppose my influences really were to do with the fact that I was absolutely crazy about playing the guitar, and still am, actually. And the guitar is definitely my favourite instrument, and my keyboard ability came later anyway. So during that period I was playing a lot of guitar, and inevitably I was really influenced by guitar players of that time, but not necessarily straightforward pop and rock music. I was a great follower of the Shadows, actually. I didn't like Cliff Richard, still don't like Cliff Richard, but actually the instrumental stuff from the Shadows was really an enormous influence on me learning the rudiments of music. So an awful lot of my harmony knowledge and everything came through the Shadows. I played in a band. We weren't very good, but one thing that did happen was that we started to use a tape recorder and get very interested in recording, which in turn led to me having a small studio at home with my parents, and this took off, and we used to do demo records for bands of the time who used to come along, and we used to record them, and as well we used to do our own stuff, and this is really where actually the writing and recording started. Another influence at that time was folk music. I was also very keen on people like Pentangle, the band, and the guitarist there, Bert Jansch, and that developed a sort of playing style which I still have really on the guitar, which is slightly more finger style than using a pick, and I even play the electric guitar like that as well, which has led to, I don't know, a certain sort of sound perhaps. So that's how it all started. John Ferdinando, with whom I did a lot of my early recording, was actually the bass player in the band that I talked about. And he got interested in the tape recorder and recording stuff and the studio in the same way that I did. And so we were already aware of the fact that mentioning players were putting on a production of Alice, and we volunteered to do the music. Well, as is always the case when people are looking round for ways of doing things, when it's local and it's amateur, they were only too pleased to take us on, but they didn't realise, I think, that we were actually going to use it as a sort of springboard, really, for our creative instincts, and it was such a fantastic subject to actually be very creative in the studio with. We really enjoyed it enormously, and we were able to use lots of different techniques, some of them really quite unusual, involving tape recording and reversing stuff, and also layering sounds on top of one another, which was very difficult in those days. You had to use a tape machine that could record on the top track a stereo tape machine that records on the top track and then plays that back to the bottom track while you add something new, and you ping-pong to and fro across the tracks until you get your final piece. But obviously tape hiss and noise were an issue, and it was quite difficult to do, so we actually got ourselves quite a technique in the end of actually managing to do this stuff. And that Alice Through the Looking Glass LP that we issued entirely for just simply members of the audience that wanted to take the music away with them, that album is now selling for a lot of money on the collector's market, and it's just amazing to think of all this time afterwards that it's still that popular. And just as a small footnote, the girl that played Alice in that production is now a very well known news presenter on BBC, BBC television and radio, Martha Carney. And she actually still remembers that time. On her website she mentions it. It was a very interesting and memorable production of that play, and I think a lot of local people still remember it with enormous affection. I'm going to deal with questions 4 and 5 quite quickly, because I've already mentioned quite a lot of things to do with those, in the sense of the recording for Alice and all that. But just in passing, you were asked about the other bands I was involved in. Well, actually, they weren't really other bands. We had a really strange habit of changing the name of the band on a frequent basis, and to be honest, I think far too much time was taken sitting around in coffee shops deciding what the name of the band should be. So don't imagine they're all different bands. They're mostly the same lineup, although there were 1 or 2 changes here and there. But really, what I think characterises the whole period is that John and I, were getting far more interested in recording than we were in playing at parties and things, and also writing music, because the problem, if you're really interested in writing music, when you play at parties, they don't particularly want to hear your new music. They want to hear the good old standards. And once you start writing music, you get so interested in doing new stuff that you don't particularly want to do everybody else's songs. So that's why we got more interested in the recording. So those bands didn't really feature very much in the great scheme of things. Just to cover the pressing of the LP that you asked about, very strangely, last night I was literally a couple of roads away from the place where that was actually pressed, in Turnham Green in London, and I don't suppose that company's there anymore. They were called Sound News Productions, quite a small company, and in those days it was very hard to produce stuff, and you had to use some professional help in making the actual album. So you'd take your master tape to somebody like these people, and they would produce what they used to call a matrix, which is the master, from which they could press any number of records. And we, as you rightly point out, had 50 done to start with, and then a further burst, because it was actually quite popular. And our experience of them really was that they treated us as a bit of a curiosity. I think there weren't many people going to them with this sort of material. They mostly used to like archive material of news and things, so I think they looked at us a rather strange way and thought, oh well, never mind, well, it's all money, we'll do it for them. But I'm very pleased that it worked out, because it's obviously sold, it's very popular now. The origin of Tomorrow Come Someday is almost more interesting than the record. I have to confess that John and I find this record our least favourite, and I think the reason for that is it actually came to pass in a different way to the Alice record. I had studied law to start with. I was very bad at it, because I was writing music at the same time, which was never very easy, and eventually I gave up the law and found a job in an opera house in Sussex called Glyndebourne, where I met somebody who was going to make an amateur film, and he asked me to write the music for it. That film eventually got called Tomorrow Come Someday, and the music on that album is for that film, all of which sounds very glamorous, but in fact it's certainly not my best work. We had problems with the singers, because it's always very difficult to find actors who can also sing, and we basically had trouble with that. So the singing on it is not great, and I think the actual composition is not certainly as good as a lot of other stuff. And I think it's partly because I was very unused to writing to somebody else's brief. Obviously later in the BBC I got used to that, but at that stage I don't think I was very used to it, and that made it slightly harder. So not one of our favourites, and we didn't have a lot of them pressed. I think in those days you had to have 50 as a minimum, and I think that's all we had. Just in passing, Agincourt was never a band that played as a band in performance. It was purely a name of a band for an album originally, and that was Fly Away. And people are often confused. The name of the album is Fly Away, and the band name is Agincourt. For John and I, actually, the Fly Away album is by far the best of the lot, because of how it now represents very much a period in sort of music history as well as our own history. It has a very particular atmosphere to it, which is very honest, actually, and just puts across a period in a terribly accurate way. And the songs on it are very honestly written. They're not trying to sound like anything else, and they actually simply are what we wanted to do at that time. And we actually teamed up with the girl singer Lee Menelaus that John used on a later album of his own, and we all got on very well, and it was a nice time, and I think that album represents some very happy memories as well for us, actually, so I think that's why we like it so much. Just to be accurate, A Game for All Who Know, which is John Ferdinando's album, came before Friends. Friends is the last album. And also, to be clear, each of them are solo albums. Although we both played on both, A Game for All Who Know, under the band name Ithaca, is entirely John Ferdinando's composition, and Friends is entirely my compositions. John's album, he was sort of writing this over quite a long period, and his influence, without doubt, was the Moody Blues. And as well as really liking the Moody Blues, I think he was also poking fun at them a little bit as well, although that side of it is never seen by people who are so enthusiastic about the album, that some of the lyrics, for instance, are purposely actually poking fun at Moody Blues lyrics. And when we were making it, I think we were rather enjoying the fact that we were actually making these rather epic sounds, almost as a takeoff of the Moody Blues. But what happens when you got two people that, by that time we were really able to be very creative in the studio, and when we actually put the album together, lots of ideas happened along the way, and actually what came out the end was something that was good in its own right, without having to sound like something else. And indeed, actually, from a production point of view, John's album is the best we could possibly have done with that studio, bearing in mind we were still using those track bouncing techniques I talked about. Based on that, I mean, the quality is just amazing. Really, I'm very pleased with that side of it. Really excellent. And it's very, very popular, and the original copies sell for a lot of money now. John actually is still in the music business only insofar as he plays bass in a band, but he's stopped writing. And in a way, it's a sort of pity, because actually that material was really original and very effective, and we really enjoyed doing it. And from my point of view, it was my opportunity to be producer of an album, and I worked very hard on getting the sounds right and getting the whole sound of the album, similar and give it sort of coherent style, which I think actually helped me enormously later on in the BBC. The Friends album is very much a collection of songs that I'd been writing around that time, that I just wanted to put down on tape, almost for my own record, really. And that album never actually had any pressings, because just around that time I managed to get a job at the BBC, which took over, rather, and I wasn't able to actually follow that through. But I'm very pleased with the songs on there, and I think they're quite an interesting variety of songs. And I'm still interested in writing songs, despite that having joined the BBC, obviously great deal of my output then was instrumental music, like title music for programs and things. But although I did write some songs for children's dramas and various things along the way, I was basically writing instrumental music. But my songwriting has actually come back into the fore again very recently, and I'll probably mention it again in answer to your later question, but I'm actually writing more songs at the moment. My work in the BBC took many, many years. When I first joined, I did join as a studio manager in radio, which is a technical operator, really, who operates the mixer and plays in, as was then, tapes and records and things like that. Really good experience. I really enjoyed it, but I think it became clear to people that I actually wrote music, because I was still very keen on that. And indeed, actually, to be absolutely accurate, some of the Friends album was recorded after I'd actually got the job at the BBC. So for the first 18 months or 2 years of my BBC time, I was actually inviting friends that I'd known from my early BBC time down to my studio to help record the songs on Friends. So there is a crossover. And Ruth Cubbin, who sings on Friends, was a person with whom I actually sang quite a bit of folk music up in London. And that's where all the crossover is. Anyway, the studio manager job led eventually to me, well, actually after about 4 years, to me joining the radiophonic workshop, which really was a dream job, because it enabled me to write music the whole time, which is what I wanted to do. And I suppose the one thing that people maybe don't realise is that it was extremely busy and hard work, and when you actually suddenly start writing music for somebody else apart from yourself, that is quite an important change. And you hardly ever get over the shock, actually. It's very much harder. And they can turn around and say, yes, it's a very nice piece of music, but it's not what we want. And basically it's being professional and doing it for a job, so it makes a big difference. As a statistic, if you actually played all the music I wrote for the BBC end to end, it would actually last 2.5 days. We're looking at a gigantic, well, what are you looking at? You're looking at about 60 hours of original music, entirely written for the BBC, so not including all the albums we've been talking about up to now, or any later stuff, just the BBC stuff is about 60 hours. So an enormous quantity of stuff, and for a variety of different programs. And but notably, I mean, mainly because it's so popular still, my work for Doctor Who is the most well known. Indeed, I was only 2 days ago in East London signing copies of DVDs of Doctor Who fans. It's incredible to think that it carries on and on after all these years. So it's very rewarding for those of us that were involved in it, for there to be so much interest still. And my BBC work, I mean, obviously was very exacting work, and I'm very pleased with lots of it. But oddly, once I left the BBC, I got involved with other work. I actually got involved in teaching, which I still do at a film school, which I enjoy enormously. And I'm teaching students music for film. It has enabled me to go back, and I think I mentioned this earlier, to go back to my original interests in writing instrumental and vocal music for myself and not writing it for anybody else. And I've almost finished an album of new music that obviously has quite an electronic feel, because that's an area that I know a lot about. But strangely, I've found it very easy to write lyrics for this new music, and so it's actually got vocal content as well. So it's almost like the joining together of all the different bits of my career, really, in this new music. So that's coming along quite fast, and I should be able to tell people about that very soon. Thanks very much for asking me to do the interview. I hope all this is helpful to you. And I'm sorry that it's going to be such a large recording for you to wade through. It's much easier for me to do it like this than it would be to type it all out. But that's me being lazy. So anyway, I hope it's what you want, and good luck with the publication. Thanks. Bye.
Just how much I needed